It was after 11 p.m. on January 30th, 2012, when Billy Payne Jr. got a call. A buddy of his wanted to come to his house in Mountain City, Tennessee to buy some drugs. But Billy didn't appreciate getting that call. Sure, Billy was a small-time drug dealer, but he wasn't the crazy bachelor he used to be a few years earlier. He was 36, and he had a family now, including a 6-month-old son who had finally fallen asleep. And so the last thing Billy needed was a late-night visitor to wake the baby up again. So at 11:30, he texted his friends saying they couldn't meet up. He explained he had to be up early in the morning for his job at the thread factory, and so he needed some rest. His friend would just have to get his pills somewhere else. But as much as this call was annoying because it was inconveniencing, the truth was Billy was actually in the process of trying to leave his drug-abusing past behind. Billy had always been the life of the party in his small town. He was the guy who always had a beer in his hand and an endless parade of girlfriends. He drove a Mustang and bragged about going to Las Vegas for the weekend. His cousin, Jamie Curd, described Billy as being a man with caviar tastes on a working man's budget. But all that high living had a price. Billy had developed a nasty addiction to opioid painkillers, an addiction that he supported in part by selling opioids himself. Billy knew he'd made his share of mistakes in his life, including the fact that he had a young son in Florida that he never saw, but his opioid addiction was the worst. It clouded his judgment, it sucked up his money, and always left him feeling desperate for more. After Billy finished texting his friend telling him not to come over, he went to go peek in on his baby, Tyler, who was all tucked into his crib. Billy smiled at the baby, and then he headed down the hall to join his girlfriend, Billie Jean Hayworth, in bed. Billie Jean was 13 years younger than Billy, and she was slender and pretty, with short brown hair. She was also an outdoorsy Tennessee girl who loved nothing better than fishing, hiking, and camping. Billy had had his eye on Billie Jean from the moment she had come to work on the cleaning crew at the thread factory 3 years earlier. And soon after they had met, the two started spending all their time together. By 2010, Billy had invited Billie Jean to move into the small one-bathroom house that he shared with his father. By 2011, Billie Jean was pregnant with Billy's child. That same year, Billy had begun going religiously to an opioid treatment center and taking a prescription drug to control his cravings. And while the new year was still only a few weeks old, Billy still had a feeling that this year, 2012, would be the year he could finally start calling himself a former opioid addict. Billy felt grateful as he looked down at his sleeping girlfriend, but he didn't look for long. He was really tired, and as soon as he laid down and his head hit the pillow, he fell asleep. But parents of infants rarely get to sleep for very long, and just after 5 a.m., baby Tyler started wailing from his crib. Billie Jean wearily swung her feet out of the bed and onto the floor, and then set off down the hall to try to calm the baby down. Billy woke up to all the commotion, and he lay there quietly, listening to the sounds of Billie Jean heating up a bottle for Tyler. He could also hear another voice out in the kitchen. It was his father. Sometimes the house felt a bit cramped, with all of them living there together, but it filled Billy with happiness to watch his father hold little Tyler. After a few minutes, Billy heard Billie Jean changing the baby's diaper, and he heard his father saying goodbye and leaving for work. Then Billy felt Billie Jean slide back into bed next to him, and then he began to nod off again, even though he knew the alarm would soon wake him up. And it was at this point that Billy heard the sound of the sliding glass side door open. Just for a moment, he thought maybe his father must have forgotten something and come back. But then a shadowy figure suddenly loomed in the bedroom doorway, standing there completely silent and still. And even in the darkness, he could tell this was not his father. Billy suddenly was terrified, and he managed to blurt out, "What the hell?" And then everything went black. Less than an hour later, at 6:25 a.m., a friend of Billy's pulled into Billy's driveway, just like he always did on weekdays. He worked at the thread factory with Billy, and they usually carpooled. From outside, the friend could see that Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom light was on, but the friend didn't want to burst in, so he sent Billy a text, asking if he was going to work today. When Billy didn't respond, his friend went around the side of the house, and then went into the house through the sliding glass door that Billy and Billie Jean always left unlocked. He called out for Billy, but got no answer, so he used the family's landline phone in the living room to call Billy's cell phone twice. But each time, no one picked up. But just then, the friend wondered if maybe the reason Billy and Billie Jean were not responding to him was because they were sharing a private, intimate moment in their bedroom, and basically the friend had walked in on them. And so out of respect, the friend just stopped what he was doing, left the house, and figured, Billy would be in touch at some point. Almost 4 hours later, another family friend, whose name was Roy Stevens, came to Billy and Billie Jean's house to pick up some mail that Billy and Billie Jean were holding for him. And just like the friend from earlier, Roy also ended up going into their house through the unlocked glass sliding door and began calling out for Billie Jean and Billy. And when no one responded, Roy walked down the hall to the couple's bedroom and went inside. And what he saw gave him the shock of his life. Billy was lying on his back on the bed, not moving and covered in blood. Roy ran to Billy and shook his arm, but it was useless. Billy was totally lifeless. Roy began screaming, "No, no, no," over and over and over again. Then he rushed outside and yelled for his wife, who was waiting in the car, to call 911. Then Roy went back inside, and he would make an even more shocking discovery. He heard a murmur coming from the baby's bedroom, and when he went into that bedroom, he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And there in her arms was her baby, breathing but asleep. The baby's forehead was smeared with their mother's blood. Roy couldn't believe what he was looking at, but he just reached down and scooped up the child, and then ran out of the house as fast as he could. Minutes later, paramedics reached the house, but there wasn't anything they could do for Billy and Billie Jean. The EMTs said the couple had likely been dead for hours. This was now a job for homicide detectives. Agent Scott Lott, a veteran detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was one of the first law enforcement officials on the scene, and he began photographing everything he saw. He knew immediately that this was not your typical East Tennessee murder that grew out of an alcohol-fueled argument or a domestic dispute. This was something more sinister. It looked like Billy had been shot with a single bullet before he could even get out of bed, and he also had this deep gash on his throat. Lott left the bedroom and walked down the hall to the nursery, and he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor by her baby's crib. She had also been shot with a single bullet. Lott knew she had to have been killed while she was clutching her baby, and the thought of that was so disturbing and just so sad. Lott got down on his hands and knees and began to look for the actual bullet that killed Billie Jean, and he found it lodged in the baby's bouncy seat. Lott was amazed that the baby had somehow been left unhurt in all of this carnage. Aside from the murder victims themselves, Lott felt like the house seemed remarkably undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle or a robbery or destruction of Billy and Billie Jean's property. Whoever committed these murders was very clean and efficient. After Lott's initial search of the house, he walked outside and waited for Billy's father to come home. Billy's father choked back sobs when he came roaring up to the house in his truck. He had gotten a call from a sheriff's deputy telling him what had happened at his house. He stepped out of the truck, and Detective Lott went over to meet him. Billy's father told Lott that everything had seemed perfectly normal when he left that morning. Billie Jean had been feeding the baby in the pre-dawn darkness, and he was getting ready for work. And now, just a few hours later, his whole property was marked off with yellow police tape, and his son and his son's girlfriend were dead. The old man just couldn't make any sense of it. But as Lott listened to Billy's distraught father, it dawned on him that the killer or killers must have planned the attack in great detail. Billy's dad said he left for work at 5:30 a.m., and Billy needed to go to work an hour later. That left only 1 hour when Billy and Billie Jean would have been home alone with the baby. Lott thought the chances were good that the killer or killers had been waiting in the dark outside the house for their opportunity to attack this young couple, and the thought of that just made Lott's skin crawl. By 2 p.m., the detectives were ready to release the bodies to the morgue for autopsy, and Lott was eager to start talking to people who knew the victims. His investigators had combed every square inch of the house and learned almost nothing from it. Lott didn't know whether he was dealing with a drug cartel hit or a serial killer or something else entirely. That afternoon, Lott and his partner, Chief Deputy Joe Woodard, asked one of Billie Jean's closest friends, Lindsay Thomas, to come down to the Mountain City Sheriff's Station. They hoped she might be able to provide some information about Billie Jean that could help the investigation. Lindsay had clearly been crying, but she came to the station ready to help find the killer or killers, even if that meant telling some of her friends' secrets. Lindsay said she suspected that the murders had something to do with drugs. She had visited Billie Jean at home the day before the killings, and Billie Jean had told her that she was selling opioid pills to help pay for Tyler's baby supplies. And Lindsay knew that Billie Jean's boyfriend, Billy, also sold opioid pills. And so Lindsay told Lott that between the two of them, they could have been in touch with some very dangerous people who would not hesitate to hurt or even kill them if something went wrong. This was news to Lott. Billy and Billie Jean did not have criminal records, and they were not under investigation by the narcotics squad either. But maybe the couple was just good at avoiding unwanted attention. The crime scene was certainly consistent with a ruthless drug gang hit, cold, efficient, and cruel, and Lott did find white crystals on the floor in Tyler's room that looked a lot like methamphetamines. And so Lott made a mental note to be sure to check back in with his narcotics squad. Then Lott asked about something Billy's dad had told him. When Billy's dad was sobbing in front of the house, he had made a comment about how there was some bad blood between his son and his son's girlfriend and this other family in town, the Potters. Now, Billy's father was too upset to explain this clearly, but from what Lott gathered, it sounded like there was some sort of internet feud between primarily Billie Jean and Janelle Potter, who was 30 years old and lived with her parents. Lindsay told detectives that she knew all about this feud. She said she'd even gotten caught up in it. But she thought the whole thing was just stupid. It was more like a middle school food fight than a reason to actually kill someone, and so Billy and Billie Jean were not afraid of the Potter family. I mean, they never even locked all their doors. Still, Lott asked Lindsay to slow down and walk the detectives through the entire feud. Lindsay said the dispute had begun more than a year earlier when people that she had never heard of began slamming her and Billie Jean on a website called Topics. It was a site where people commented on local issues, sometimes anonymously. One person had accused Lindsay of threatening to hurt Janelle, and he said that Janelle's defenders might hurt Lindsay too. And so he warned Lindsay to, quote, watch her back. For months, Topics users alleged that Lindsay and Billie Jean were out to get Janelle, and that they might even physically assault her. Lindsay told the detectives that she and Billie Jean had tried to ignore the taunts because the whole idea was absurd. The two women barely knew Janelle and really had no reason to want to hurt her. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean ultimately became convinced that Janelle Potter herself was orchestrating the social media posts against them as a way to make herself look like a victim and maybe get some sympathy. Lindsay explained that Janelle was a very immature person who had never had a job, never had a driver's license, or really a real boyfriend, so she had plenty of time to stir up some trouble. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean eventually filed harassment charges against Janelle, but a judge threw out their complaints for lack of evidence. After that, Billy got involved, and he called Janelle's mother in hopes of ending the dispute. But the mother stood by her daughter, and before long, the phone call had turned into a shouting match, with Janelle crying in the background. Lott looked over at his partner Woodard, and he nodded. They both knew this was a strange lead, but it was the best thing they had so far, so they had to go talk to the Potters next. The next morning, so February 1st, the two detectives drove out to the Potters' home, located a few miles from where Billy and Billie Jean had lived and died. Janelle's father, Buddy, opened the front door even before Lott and Woodard could ring the doorbell. He would tell them that he'd actually been expecting them because everybody in town always pointed fingers at his family. Lott could see that Buddy was a very proud United States Marine. He wore a Marine Corps hat, and his living room table was covered with military honors, including decorations from combat in Vietnam. Buddy said that he and his wife had moved here from Pennsylvania a few years back after a severe fall ended Buddy's military career, and now they were just enjoying retirement. But Buddy acknowledged that their daughter, Janelle, really struggled sometimes. He explained that she had a hearing problem when she was young that made it really difficult for her to carry on normal conversations, and at 6 feet tall, she felt really awkward and struggled to talk to boys. So as the years went by, she spent more and more of her time alone at home. Buddy said that his daughter was so vulnerable that he and his wife often had to be very protective. Anybody who wanted to do something socially with Janelle had to meet Buddy and her mother, Barbara, first. And Buddy said they worried constantly that Janelle was being bullied. That's when Barbara chimed in. She said the feud between their family and Billie Jean and her friends was a perfect example of the way Janelle was bullied. Barbara said that, Billie Jean and Lindsay would pick on Janelle so regularly that she and Buddy sometimes worried that their daughter might end up hurting herself. Janelle sat quietly as her parents talked about her to the detectives. But eventually, Janelle would speak up, and she would say that she didn't understand why Billie Jean and Lindsay were targeting her. She said she never posted insults about Billie Jean or anybody else online, but some of the people who came to Janelle's defense online fiercely criticized Billie Jean and Lindsay. Janelle said she believed that Billie Jean and Billy and Lindsay were trying to make her feel completely alone. She said that Billie had also attacked her closest supporters, falsely accusing her friend, Jamie Curd, of selling drugs. Lot's eyes widened at the mention of Jamie Curd. He'd heard that name when interviewing people who were close to Billie. And so he stopped Janelle and he asked, "Isn't that Billie's cousin?" And Janelle nodded and said, "Yes." Lot acted surprised. Lot told Janelle he understood that Jamie and Billie were not only relatives, but also close friends. So why would Billie attack Jamie? Janelle explained that Jamie actually was no longer friends with his cousin Billie anymore because he had learned how badly Billie and Billie Jean and Lindsay were mistreating Janelle. The two detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked the Potters for their time. Then they got up and walked outside and made their way over to their car, all the while puzzling over the strange story they'd just heard. Also, Janelle's way of talking just seemed very immature to them, and not just because of her high-pitched, childlike voice, but also because she portrayed everything in terms of petty rivalries that really did seem like something from middle school. But the online harassment that Janelle and her parents described sounded very serious to Lot. And if Janelle really did look at the world like a middle school kid, she would be an easy target. So Lot could see why the Potter family was on edge at the mention of Billie and Billie Jean. Lot and Woodard agreed they needed to speak with Billie's cousin, Jamie, as soon as possible. Clearly, he had a ringside seat for the family feud, and so maybe he could give the detectives some sense of how deep the anger ran on both sides. Later that day, narcotics officers listened politely as Agent Lot described the evidence that Billie and Billie Jean were selling drugs out of their home, potentially putting their lives at risk. But the narcotics officers were not impressed. They said at most, Billie and Billie Jean were small-time dealers who were selling just to their inner circle. The narcotics officers went on to say that typically they investigated people who sold hundreds of times more product than Billie and Billie Jean. If anyone was going to get killed over a drug deal gone bad, it would likely be major dealers, not just some random young couple with a little bag of pills. Nothing the narcotics officer said surprised Lot, but the dead end left him with only one real lead in the case. Now he was even more interested in his upcoming conversation with Jamie Curd. By the time Jamie walked into the sheriff's office on Thursday, February 2nd, so 2 days after the murder, the detectives had thoroughly scrubbed his background. They talked to friends of the victims, as well as Jamie's own sister, about Jamie's relationship with Billie and Janelle. People said that Billie was probably the best friend Jamie had ever had. The two men had worked together on the same exact machine at the thread factory, and then they often went out and partied together after the shift was over. And when Jamie's dog died a few years ago, Billie had even come over with beer to commiserate and to comfort his cousin. And when Jamie couldn't find a girlfriend, Billie had introduced him to Janelle Potter, who had just as much trouble getting a date as Jamie did. And Jamie and Janelle hit it off and began spending time together, but they had one problem. Janelle's parents did not like Jamie. At one point, they even banned him from coming inside their house. And so that was when Jamie began offering to come over and repair the Potter family's computers, because it was literally the only way he could think of that he could still see Janelle. But Jamie's relationship with Janelle ultimately drove a wedge between Jamie and his cousin Billie as the online feud spread to Facebook and other social media, and then to the courts. In the end, Jamie had to choose between his girl and his best friend, and he picked his girl, and the two men stopped speaking to each other. Now, the detectives wondered how far Jamie would go to defend Janelle. From the moment Jamie entered the police interview room, with a baseball hat pulled down low over his sleepy eyes, Lott had the sense of a man who was a follower, not a leader. Jamie himself was quick to make it clear that he was a country boy who had never strayed too far from eastern Tennessee. He said he didn't really use computers much himself, even though he was enough of a handyman to repair them, but he knew that Billy and Billie Jean were posting threats against Janelle on Facebook and other websites. And Jamie just couldn't understand why Billy would do that, or why Billy denied that it was true. Jamie said he saw firsthand the damage that Billy and Billie Jean's threats were doing to Janelle. Jamie said he had seen Janelle suffer these paralyzing panic attacks over some of the things that Billy and Billie Jean were saying about her. And Jamie said at some point he just couldn't take it. He just could not bear to watch his girl get hurt. Detective Lott said he could only imagine how hard it would be to watch your girlfriend be bullied. Jamie tried to interrupt, claiming that Janelle was not his girlfriend, but Lott ignored him. He said it must have been hard for Jamie to keep from hurting the people who were hurting Janelle. Then Lott leaned forward and looked right at Jamie, and he asked him a very surprising and blunt question. Would you shoot a woman with a baby in her arms? Startled, Jamie just sat there for a moment before he answered with one word: no. And Jamie instantly offered to take a lie detector test to prove he really had nothing to do with these murders. And after that, he went silent. And so the detectives just sat there in silence and stared at Jamie, hoping he would eventually chime in with useful information. And for a while, all Jamie did was just sit slouched in his chair, but then suddenly Jamie sat up and he began wildly looking all around the interview room as though he was looking for someone who was watching them. Then he looked right at the detectives, and his eyes were wide and his voice got really quiet, and he asked them, "Is the CIA here?" Lott and his partner were dumbfounded, but also intrigued. Why would the Central Intelligence Agency, the country's international spy agency, have anything to do with a double murder in rural Tennessee? Jamie glanced from detective to detective, hoping for an answer to his question, but the two detectives didn't say anything, mostly because this was a totally outrageous question that didn't seem legitimate. But what was absolutely clear in this moment was the two detectives knew they had to figure out what in the world Jamie was talking about. On the other side of town, Janelle's mother, Barbara, had no idea that Jamie was talking to the police at that very moment. But she would have known exactly why Jamie was asking about the CIA. And she, for one, was grateful that one particular spy did keep an eye on Mountain City, Tennessee. For more than a year, Barbara had been emailing back and forth with a CIA agent named Chris, and they had grown very close, like mother and son. In fact, she even sometimes addressed him as son. Chris, the CIA agent, had gone to high school with Janelle more than a decade earlier. And even though his career had taken him around the world since those days, he still kept a protective eye on his high school classmate, and he would let Barbara know whenever he learned of any threats to Janelle's safety. Months before the murders, in April of 2011, Chris had emailed Barbara to let her know that Billie Jean and two other women had been prowling around their property at night. Chris said he suspected the women were up to no good, but he was in no position to do anything. He had just broken his arm, and he was in a cast. However, Chris said he had tapped the phone line in Billy and Billie Jean's house, so he would be able to keep track of their conversations. That way, they would know if Billy and Billie Jean were planning anything else. Barbara couldn't thank Chris enough for the warning. He was like a guardian angel. "We love you, son," she wrote back to him. And in the email, she also reassured Chris that her husband, Buddy, was in, quote, Vietnam jungle recon mode, end quote, and he would be ready if any intruders tried to enter their home. Billy's cousin Jamie had also struck up a relationship with Chris, the CIA agent, and Jamie often poured his heart out to the spy about how much he loved Janelle. Chris had assured Jamie that he had a great girl, but he warned Jamie that Billy and Billie Jean and their friends, they really wanted to make Janelle's life hell, and that would definitely affect Jamie's life. So when Jamie returned to the police station to take his lie detector test that he requested on February 6, 2012, so almost a week after the murders, he hoped that Chris, the CIA agent, might be looking out for him. But things didn't go so well for Jamie. The lie detector analyst concluded that Jamie was being deceptive when he claimed he didn't know anything about the murders of Billy and Billie Jean. And so this meant it was very likely that Jamie was hiding something. And this was exactly what Agent Lott was hoping for. Now he'd be able to really up the pressure on Jamie and basically force him to either spill his guts or risk facing first-degree murder charges. And so, Agent Lott walked into the interview room where Jamie was once again waiting, and Lott felt ready to break this man down. For the next 2 hours, Lott, along with another detective, threw one question after another at Jamie. What was he hiding? Why was he lying? Was anyone else involved in the murders? And Jamie just sat there mumbling, I don't know, or just grumbling without even answering at all. Finally, the detectives actually started taking pity on Jamie, saying they knew he was not the mastermind. He was probably just following someone else's instructions. Lott said that maybe Jamie didn't shoot anyone, but he needed to tell them who did. But Jamie just continued to mumble and stammer his way, and so Lott was getting really frustrated. So he just left the room and typed up a written statement, a confession for Jamie to sign, that admitted he played a role in the murders. And so Lott came back in the room with the statement, and he slid the confession with a pen across the table to Jamie, and Jamie just stared at it for a long time, doing nothing. But eventually, Jamie picked up the pen and he signed his name down at the bottom. After the interrogation ended, Jamie looked completely defeated, and so he very quickly just agreed to let the detectives come out to the parking lot and search his car. And in his car, scrawled on a scrap of paper on the front passenger seat, the detectives found email addresses for not only Jamie, but also for Barbara and Janelle. This was like a goldmine to Lott. Now that Jamie had confessed to a backup role in the murders, the detectives could get a search warrant to see all the messages written to and from these email addresses in the months leading up to the murders. If there was a larger plot to murder Billy and Billie Jean, then the detectives would soon know about it. A few days later, the email company sent the detectives an electronic file containing thousands of emails sent or received by Jamie, Barbara, and Janelle over the previous year. And so suddenly, the detectives had a window into why the Potter family lived in such fear. The detectives quickly started seeing correspondence from a CIA agent named Chris Chodden, who was warning with increasing urgency that Billy, Billie Jean, and their friends were harassing and threatening Janelle. The emails were chatty and personal, sometimes weaving in stories from Chris's CIA work or references to his 3 Great Danes, but frequently coming back to his concerns that these bullies might follow through on their threats to hurt Janelle. Lott couldn't believe that a CIA agent would use his official position to get involved in a family feud in rural Tennessee. The emails showed that for months in 2011, Chris had tried to get a CIA ID card for Janelle's father, Buddy, so that Buddy could acquire military-grade weapons that are normally off-limits to civilians. And so the whole thing just seemed extremely unprofessional to the detectives. So Lott and another detective decided to track down Chris and just ask him what was going on. The detectives found a guy named Chris Chodden who graduated with Janelle from a high school in Pennsylvania, and so Lott got his phone number and called him up. Chris seemed surprised to be getting a call from police in Tennessee, but he agreed to talk. And the next day, Lott and the other detective drove up from Mountain City to Delaware to meet with Chris for coffee at his house. After the detectives and Chris had taken a seat at the kitchen table, they talked for a few minutes, just kind of general niceties, and then Lott just pushed a stack of papers across the table to Chris and told him they were copies of emails that he had written to his old high school classmate, Janelle Potter. But Chris just looked blankly at the papers and then at the detectives, and he said he had never sent an email to Janelle Potter, ever. He knew her in high school, but they were never really friends and did not stay in touch after graduation. He said he didn't know what those papers were, but they had nothing to do with him. Lott then asked Chris about his work for the CIA, and Chris nearly broke out laughing. The CIA? Chris said he was a police officer, just like the 2 detectives, but he had never had anything to do with the CIA, and he certainly wasn't a spy. Lott asked Chris if he had broken his arm recently, and Chris said he had never broken it. Lott and the other detective believed Chris. He was nothing like the brash CIA agent in the emails, and he seemed genuinely surprised to be asked questions about a woman he barely knew. But now Lott needed to know, if Chris was not the author of all those emails, who was? The emails that the detectives had obtained from their search warrant were enough to fill an entire banker's box when they were printed out, and they included countless emails from Chris himself. But using them to solve a crime was another question altogether. They were not in any particular order, and they covered a wide array of subjects, from everyday trivia like Janelle's love of floppy-eared dogs to Chris's tale of international assassinations. If investigators were going to figure out Chris's true identity, they needed a specialist who could really focus and not be distracted by every twist and turn of the investigation. So they turned to a veteran state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who agreed to read every single email until he had a better sense of who Chris really was. For days, Brooks spent his evenings immersed in the electronic world that the Potters and Jamie shared with Chris. Brooks concluded that Chris, if nothing else, wrote like he was a homicidal maniac. In notes to Buddy, Barbara, and Jamie alike, Chris would talk about the need to eliminate Billy and Billie Jean and their friends. He closed one message in particular to the Potters with the words, "Kill, kill, kill," all in capital letters. And of course, Brooks suspected that whoever this person was, this Chris person, they did not work for the CIA. Real CIA operatives, the kind who killed people as part of their job, were notoriously secretive, and Chris was anything but. He seemed to openly brag about his most important assignments. But there was one striking thing about every single one of the notes from Chris that convinced Brooks that the real author, the real Chris, could only be one person. And that person was the mastermind behind the murders of Billy and Billie Jean, using others as unwitting pawns. The night that Jamie Curd signed his confession, he did finally break down and talk in great detail about his role in the murders. Then, once investigators had thoroughly analyzed all the emails, they did have a clear picture of how the murders played out. And so here is a reconstruction of how police believe Billy and Billie Jean were murdered in their home on January 31st. Around midnight on January 31st, so right as Billy was crawling into bed, a few miles away, Billy and Billie Jean's killer told Jamie that they needed a favor from him. Would Jamie take a ride to Billy and Billie Jean's house and stand lookout? Jamie knew what this favor really meant. The killer was finally going to take drastic action against Billy and Billie Jean, and they needed someone else for backup. Jamie did not like this idea, but he had known this night was coming for months, and so he agreed to go. So Jamie and the killer drove to a church that was near Billy and Billie Jean's house, where they could see whoever left or entered, and they waited. Eventually, they saw the light go on as Billie Jean brought her baby into the kitchen for a bottle. Then they saw Billy's father packing his lunch for work, and then walking out the door around 5:30 a.m. This was the moment they were waiting for, when Billy and Billie Jean were all alone with just their baby in the house. Now, the couple was going to get what was coming to them. Jamie and the killer put on gloves, and then the killer gave Jamie a handgun so they'd both be armed. Then the killer and Jamie got out of the car, they made their way over to Billy and Billie Jean's house, and the killer slid open the unlocked glass doors on the side of the house, and then they walked inside and headed straight for Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom. Once the killer reached the bedroom, they stood in the doorway to gather their courage for a moment, and then they entered the room. And as soon as they did, Billy woke up and he yelled out, "What the hell?" But the killer was on top of Billy before he could do anything. And the killer put their gun just inches from Billy's face and fired. At this point, Billie Jean, who's right next to Billy, began to scream and she ran out of the room, but she didn't get far because Jamie was standing guard in front of the door that would lead outside. So Billie Jean couldn't escape. Instead, she ran down the hallway to her baby's room and pulled him out of the crib and held him close to her body. And then the killer just stepped into the room, rushed at Billie Jean, they raised their gun and shot her point blank in the side of the head. Billie Jean crumpled onto the floor, still clutching her baby. The killer simply turned around, walked back into the hall, and headed back to the main bedroom. And there, they walked back over to Billy, and just to make sure he was dead, the killer drew a knife and slit Billy's throat ear to ear. Then the killer walked out of the bedroom and met Jamie at the front door. Jamie gave his gun back to the killer and then ran outside to vomit. And that was it. The intruders got back in their car and sped off. They were in and out of the house in less than 3 minutes, leaving behind 2 dead bodies and a baby who would grow up without parents. But the killer was satisfied with what they had done. At least now his daughter, Janelle, would be safe. Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, killed Billy and Billie Jean. But police did not believe he was the one who actually set the murders in motion, or that he was the one pretending to be the mysterious CIA agent, Chris. Still, police easily had enough evidence to arrest Buddy, and they hoped that once they had him in custody, he would confirm that somebody else had pushed him to kill. But Buddy owned dozens of guns, and he often carried them no matter what he was doing, whether he was mowing the grass or out at a restaurant, he was always carrying. So when Agent Lott and Chief Deputy Woodard drove out to the Potter house early on a mid-February morning to arrest Buddy, they called ahead to let Buddy know they were just coming by with some follow-up questions. The last thing the 2 detectives wanted was to surprise Buddy and accidentally trigger an armed standoff. When they got there, Buddy let the 2 detectives into the house, but the moment Lott told him they were actually there to arrest him for murder, Buddy reached for a gun. But Lott and Woodard were ready, and they instantly tackled Buddy, pinning his arms and getting him into handcuffs. Then they dragged him outside, put him in the cruiser, and went back to the sheriff's office. On the ride, the detectives told Buddy they knew that he loved his family and he was just trying to protect them. He was no monster. After all, Buddy didn't kill the baby. The detectives reassured Buddy that they understood. The world was going to hell, and sometimes violence was the only solution, right? After all, someone else had warned Buddy his daughter was in danger. And with that, tears began to well up in Buddy's eyes in the backseat of the cruiser, and his voice cracked as he shared with the detectives all the terrible things the CIA agent Chris had told him that Billy and Billie Jean were going to do to his daughter. And it was just too much for him. He had to act. Now, while Buddy clearly missed all the red flags in the emails coming from the CIA agent Chris that clearly indicated he was not who he said he was, the state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who reviewed all those emails, he caught the red flags, and it was one particular red flag, a chronic error that popped up in many of the emails, that ultimately led Brooks to discover the fake CIA agent's true identity. Time and again in these emails, Chris made a spelling mistake that was far more typical for a school child than an adult CIA agent. Chris always forgot to drop the letter E from the end of verbs when he added the letters ing to them. So words like loving, taking, and caring all contained the extra E in the middle. And that was the same error that Brooks had seen over and over again when reading emails sent from another person, Janelle Potter. And so Brooks told investigators that Chris had been a figment of Janelle's imagination all along, but one that she had used to very effectively manipulate her entire family. Janelle had basically catfished her own family into believing that she was in mortal danger, and ultimately, that caused her father to go out and kill Billy and Billie Jean. A year and a half later, Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, was found guilty of killing Billy and Billie Jean and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. As for Jamie Curd, the star prosecution witness, he agreed to a plea deal that required him to serve 25 years in prison. Janelle and her mother Barbara went on trial for their roles in promoting the double murder. Janelle's attorney argued that she was too childlike to murder anyone, and she shouldn't be punished because her father was overly protective. But the jury was not buying it, and ultimately she and her mother were both sentenced to life in prison. On an afternoon in January of 2012, 56-year-old Jane Beshara and her husband Bob were standing in the front yard of their large 5-bedroom, 2-story home in Grosse Pointe Park, a wealthy suburb of Detroit, Michigan. Jane was tall, with short light brown hair, and she was wearing jeans, a sweater, and a black nylon jacket. The temperature was barely above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but for people who had grown up in Michigan, like Jane and Bob, it didn't really feel that cold. And it wasn't snowing that day, so Jane thought it would be the perfect time to show Bob where she wanted to make some updates to the house and to the yard. So, the two of them walked around outside and talked about how they could make their home even more beautiful than it already was. Bob, or Big Bob, as he was known by most of their friends, was a huge 6'4" tall guy with broad shoulders and dark hair. and he made his living in real estate and property management, so he enjoyed figuring out ways to update houses and increase their worth, especially when it was his own personal home. Bob had grown up wealthy, but he'd always wanted to add to the money he'd inherited from his family. So he had started his own business, and now he collected rent on multiple properties in the area, including houses, apartments, and buildings with bars and restaurants inside of them. But it was Bob's height, not his money, that had first attracted Jane to him when they met at a party all the way back in 1983. Jane didn't think looks were the most important trait in a man, but she was tall, and she liked tall guys, so when she had seen Bob towering over everybody else around him, he caught her eye. But once Jane and Bob had started talking that night at the party and spending time together afterwards, their attraction went far beyond physical appearance. They discovered they had a lot in common. Jane and Bob were both devoutly religious. Jane volunteered at her church, and Bob served as a deacon in his congregation. And once they had started dating, they enjoyed going to church services together. And they were also both really driven. Bob had worked very hard to start and grow his business, and even at a young age, Jane had made her way up the corporate ladder to land a high-paying marketing position. But the biggest thing that had drawn them together when they were young was that they had both wanted to start a family. And so, after dating for about 2 years, Jane and Bob had gotten married, and not long after that, they had 2 kids, a son and then a daughter. And then Jane and Bob, along with their 2 kids, had moved into their dream home in Grosse Pointe Park. But now, both of their kids were out of the house. Their son had moved away for work, and their daughter had recently gone off to college. And so Jane and Bob were now adjusting to their new lives as empty nesters. And so they tried to find other things to focus on. They worked hard running charity fundraisers in the community, they spent more time with their friends, and they decided to do work on the house that they never had a chance to do when their kids were younger. As the couple walked around their property looking for things they wanted to fix, Bob said he knew someone who could get started very soon on some of these updates they wanted to make. Bob said the guy's name was Joseph Gentz, and that he used him often as a handyman and yard guy at some of the properties that he managed. Jane said that would be great, but the truth was, she had actually met Joseph when he'd done some small repairs around the house, and she didn't really like him that much. Joseph was as big as Bob was, but not nearly as calm or soft-spoken. And Jane knew that Joseph had intellectual disabilities that sometimes made it difficult for him to communicate clearly. And when he got frustrated, Jane had seen that he would lash out, and it was kind of frightening. But Bob believed helping Joseph and making sure he had steady work and income was the right thing to do. And Jane couldn't argue with that because she believed people should do whatever they could to help those who were less fortunate than they were. So Jane smiled at Bob and said she was excited about the work they were going to get done on the house. Then she headed inside to get ready for a wine night she was hosting at the house for some of her friends. Later that night, Jane opened the front door for the first of her guests, and when she did, she looked out and she could see all the lights from the houses across the street shining on the perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars parked outside. And so even though her kids were no longer living there with them anymore, which made Jane feel a little bit sad, Jane still felt like Grosse Pointe Park was the perfect place to live. But there was another side, a hidden side, to the Detroit suburbs that seemed like a completely different world from Jane and Bob's quiet neighborhood. And on a night in January, not long after Jane had her friends over, a person who was known online as, quote, Master, arrived at an event space that was part of that other hidden side of the suburbs. Master wrapped their arm around their partner's waist and then walked into a party filled with members of the local BDSM community. BDSM stands for bondage, domination, submission, and sadomasochism, and so the BDSM community was a group that practiced varying degrees of bondage, domination, submission, and sadomasochism, often in a sexual setting. Master was well known in the BDSM community because they hosted small gatherings of their own at a nearby dungeon, a 2-room basement outfitted with a bed, whips, ropes, and other materials common to the BDSM scene. So, at the January party, Master and their partner made their way around the venue, said hello to the people they knew, and introduced themselves to people they hadn't met before. Loud music was playing and partygoers danced, drank, and talked. Some of the guests were dressed casually, almost like they'd come straight from work, but some were wearing head-to-toe leather, and others wore dog collars attached to leashes around their necks. And everybody, no matter what they were wearing, looked relaxed and like they were having a great time. Some people on the outside who were aware of the BDSM community thought this group was strange at best and dangerous at worst. But the truth was, most of the people at the party that night had healthy relationships, successful careers, and loving families. This was just one aspect of their lives that they had entered into happily and consensually. But Master was something different, and some members of the community, including some people at this party, wanted nothing to do with them. These people saw Master as someone who used the cover of BDSM to act out on their unchecked violent tendencies, and it would turn out those people were right. As Master walked through that party, they were totally preoccupied with violent thoughts. Because Master and their partner had big plans for the future. They wanted to invite a third person into their relationship who would live with them full-time in a brand new house they were going to buy. But Master knew doing something like that wasn't going to be easy. It would take work and a ton of money. And so, Master had recently decided that to achieve their goals for the future, they would have to kill someone. And they had already chosen a target. It was a person who lived a relatively quiet life in a beautiful home in a wealthy suburb. At about 4:45 p.m. on January 24th, 2012, a couple of weeks after that BDSM party had taken place, Jane drove down the street through her neighborhood in her black Mercedes-Benz SUV. And as she drove, she was smiling and chatting on the phone with her daughter. Then Jane pulled into her driveway and hit the garage door opener. She told her daughter she would call her back in a little while once she'd gotten settled and changed out of her work clothes. Then she told her daughter she loved her, said goodbye, and hung up the phone. Jane pulled the Mercedes into the garage and then closed the garage door behind her and then glanced at the clock on the dashboard. She knew Bob wouldn't be home for a few hours because he was meeting a potential client for a drink, so she figured she'd relax for a little while, maybe have something to eat, and then call her daughter back. Then Jane turned off the engine, stepped out of her car, but right away she heard something behind her. Jane turned around and immediately froze. Someone was in the garage with her. Jane shouted at them, and the person lunged at her and shoved her against the car door. But Jane pushed back and stumbled forward. She was confused and terrified, and she thought she was being robbed. Then the person in the garage grabbed Jane from behind, raised up their fist, and slammed it into the back of Jane's head. Jane fell forward and hit the ground hard. Her head was pounding, but she tried to pull herself up. But before Jane could move, she felt a sharp pain in her neck and throat, and she struggled to breathe, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Bob pulled into the driveway and opened the garage door, and the garage was empty. Bob parked his car, went inside the house, and walked across the first floor to the living room. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV. Then he gave his wife a call, but Jane didn't answer, so he left a message letting her know he was home and that he was just checking in to see where she was and when she would be home. And then Bob hung up and watched some more TV. But after a couple of hours went by with no word from Jane, Bob started to worry, so he called her again, but she still didn't answer. So Bob called a few of Jane's friends to see if she was with them or if maybe they had seen her, but they told him that no, she was not with them and they didn't know where she was. And so starting to panic, Bob started calling family members. And when he heard that Jane had told their daughter she was going to call her back but never did, Bob became very worried. So at around 11 p.m., 6 hours after Jane had pulled into her garage and been attacked by that stranger, Bob called 911 to report his wife was missing. But it had only been a few hours since someone had spoken to Jane, and Jane was an adult, so it was way too early to actually file a missing persons report. However, the officer told Bob that they would try to locate Jane to make sure everything was okay. And so Bob gave them Jane's description, along with Jane's phone number, and the make, model, and license plate number of Jane's car. But hours later, Bob still hadn't heard anything, so he called the police again. And they told him they still had not been able to find Jane, she wasn't picking up her phone, and they had not found her SUV. The police told Bob to stay calm, and they told him they would let him know if they learned anything new. But when Bob hung up, he couldn't calm down, and he ended up staying awake most of the night waiting to hear something. But by the time the sun rose on January 25th, Grosse Pointe Park police still had no idea where Jane Bashara was. On the morning of January 25th, about 9 hours after Bob had first called the police, a tow truck driver was cruising the streets in an old neighborhood in East Detroit. Over the years, this neighborhood had become a popular spot in the city for drug dealers to do business, and it was seen as a hub for heroin users in Detroit. Because of that, a lot of the houses in this area had been abandoned, and people also often abandoned cars in this part of the city. And that's why the tow truck driver had made it a point to drive through the neighborhood every once in a while. So the driver scanned the streets from his truck, looking for cars he might be able to tow, but nothing really jumped out at him. But then he turned onto a side street and he drove past an alley, and when he did, he slammed on his brakes. He looked out his window into the alley and was shocked at what he saw: a beautiful black Mercedes-Benz SUV. The tow truck driver was used to finding cars stranded in the area, but he never saw cars that cost as much money as the one he was looking at. So the tow truck driver pulled his truck into the alley and parked close behind the SUV. Then he grabbed a pad of paper and a pen, and he wrote down the license plate number. Then the tow truck driver called his boss and told him about this car. He gave him the license plate number, and then he asked if he could go ahead and tow the vehicle. But the tow truck driver was shocked when his boss abruptly shouted at him to stay right where he was and not do anything. The tow truck driver asked what was going on, and his boss said the cops were looking for that car, so he just needed to stay there and not touch the car. The driver said he understood and hung up. And then, minutes later, the tow truck driver heard police sirens blaring through the neighborhood, and soon his truck was blocked in the alley by multiple police cars. The tow truck driver tried to stay calm as a police officer with the Detroit Police Department approached the tow truck. The driver knew he had not done anything wrong, but he'd also never had police swarm around a car he was trying to tow. So the driver got out of his truck, he answered some basic questions from the cop, and said he'd been cruising around when he saw this car, and he made it clear that he had not done anything other than take down the license plate number and call it in to his boss. The police officer thanked the tow truck driver and then walked down the alley towards the Mercedes. Then the police officer leaned in close to the back window on the passenger side, and he shielded his eyes with his hands to cut down on the glare. And when he got a clear view of the back seat of this car, he immediately yelled out for the other police officers to come over and take a look. And soon after, they got the car door open and stared at the back seat in disbelief. There on the back seat was a badly bruised and beaten dead body. But the body looked like it had been posed. The victim was on their knees with their face down on the seat, and a black nylon jacket had been put on the body backwards, so it looked like the victim was wearing a straitjacket. Once the officers got over the initial shock of what they had found, they proceeded to search the entire car. And during this search, they found an open purse lying on the front passenger seat floorboard. The contents of the purse had spilled out, and they quickly found a checkbook, credit cards, and a driver's license. The victim in the back seat Not long after her discovery, homicide detective Donald Olson of the Detroit Police parked his car near the alley and stepped outside. The cold weather, like most things, didn't really affect Olson. He had been a detective for a long time, and so he'd seen his share of horrible violence and strange cases all across Detroit. So, as he approached the officers who had first arrived on the scene, he didn't really expect to see or hear anything that would rattle him. But when Olson looked into the backseat of the Mercedes and saw Jane's body in that pose, he admitted he was shocked by it. And it wasn't just because of the pose Jane had been found in. Detective Olson just couldn't understand how a wealthy, middle-aged woman from Grosse Pointe Park had ended up dead in a neighborhood in East Detroit that was known for drug deals and heroin use. Soon after Olson's arrival, the alley was blocked off with crime scene tape and filled with police. Olson's initial take was that Jane's death had not been a part of a robbery because her credit cards and checkbook were left behind in clear view inside of her car. But Olson wanted to wait for more information before he started forming any theories. And so, as forensics experts took blood samples and fingerprints from Jane's car and her body, Olson stepped away and called the Grosse Pointe Park Police. And that police department was about as different from the Detroit police as possible. While Detroit cops had dealt with close to 400 reported homicide cases during the previous year, Grosse Pointe Park hadn't had a single reported homicide in about a decade. So when Olson called to tell them that Detroit police had found a murder victim who was a Grosse Pointe Park resident, the officer on the other line was stunned. Then Olson said they needed to inform the victim's husband, Bob Beshara, and Olson said he would drive out to Grosse Pointe Park to accompany the officer delivering the news to Bob's house. Olson knew the small suburban police department would not have dealt with a case like this before, so he wanted to be there when Jane's husband was given the news. Because Olson knew the first place to start with a homicide like this was almost always with the spouse, even if it was just to rule them out. So Olson got in his car and drove from the neighborhood in East Detroit where Jane had been found to Grosse Pointe Park. The drive only took him about 20 minutes, but as Olson looked out at the huge homes and the fancy cars lining the streets, he felt like he might as well have traveled to a different planet. At around 10:45 a.m., almost 2 hours after Jane's body had been discovered, Detective Olson and an officer from the Grosse Pointe Park Police walked up to Bob and Jane's front door. But before they could even ring the bell, the door swung open and Bob stepped outside. His hair was a mess and his eyes were bloodshot, and the first thing he said to them was he had been waiting all night to hear anything from the police, so what's going on? But then Bob noticed the looks on Olson and the other officer's face, and immediately he just dropped his head and slumped over. Olson gently asked if they could come inside to talk, and Bob nodded. Then Bob turned around and slowly led them through the entryway into the dining room, where they all sat down at a long dining room table. Then Olson looked at Bob and in a quiet voice said Detroit police had located his wife's car and they had found her body inside. And even though Bob was obviously shaken up, his reaction to this was to immediately start recounting all the events of the previous day, telling Detective Olson where his wife had been and where he had been. Olson thought this was a strange, somewhat defensive reaction, but he knew from experience, people reacted very strangely to horrible news like this. And when Bob finally slowed down and stopped talking, Olson just said he was very sorry for his loss and that he did not want to impose right now. But he asked if Bob would be willing to stop by the Grosse Pointe Park Police Department the following day to answer some questions. Bob said he would definitely do that and that he was willing to do anything they wanted to help them figure out what happened to his wife. Olson and the other officer told Bob again how sorry they were, and they thanked him for taking a few minutes to talk to them, and then the officers walked out of the house and headed for their car. And once the police were gone, Bob was forced to call his kids and his family to tell them the horrible news. And as Bob made these very difficult calls, word began to spread through Grosse Pointe Park that Jane had been found dead in the backseat of her car in East Detroit, and it sent the town into a sort of shock. People couldn't believe that this had happened to someone who had been so well liked in such a vital part of their community. And a lot of people who heard the news and who talked to Bob made it clear they wanted to come together right away to do something to honor Jane. And so that evening, Bob stepped out of his house and took part in a huge candlelight vigil right in his front yard to honor his wife. And that night, scenes from this candlelight vigil made it onto the news, and Detective Olson realized by seeing the images just how much of an impact Jane's death had had on her entire community. And so he hoped he would be able to bring the case to a quick close so they could all start to heal. On the same night as this candlelight vigil, so January 25th, which was the same day that Jane was found in East Detroit, the person known online as Master grabbed their phone and called their partner. Master told their partner to come over to their house so they could discuss the big plans they had been making for the future, bringing a third person into their relationship and buying a new home together. But their partner seemed upset and distant, and for a minute, Master started to worry. They were sure they had never mentioned their thoughts about killing someone to their partner, but now they wondered if somehow they had slipped up, and if their partner suspected that they had something to do with the murder that was now all over the news. And so Master asked their partner one more time to come by the house, but their partner flatly refused and hung up the phone not long after. And so Master just sat there in silence for a moment, trying not to panic, because all that was going through their mind was, if my own partner thinks I might have killed someone, isn't it just a matter of time before the police think the same thing? The following morning, so on January 26th, one day after Jane's body had been discovered, Bob followed an officer through the Grosse Pointe Park police station to a small interrogation room. Bob walked across the brightly lit room with stark white walls, greeted Detective Olson and the other officer he'd seen at his house the day before, and then took a seat at a small table that was pressed up against the wall. Olson sat down next to Bob and thanked him for coming in. Then Olson asked Bob if he had been able to think of anything that might help them, or if he knew of anyone who might have had a grudge against Jane. But Bob said he couldn't think of anything because none of this made any sense to him. He said Jane was well loved in town, at her job, at their church, and as far as he knew, she had never even driven to that part of Detroit where she was found. And so Bob just kept saying over and over again that really none of this made any sense. Olson said he understood, but then he leaned across the small table and looked Bob dead in the eye, and then Olson said he knew every marriage had its problems and that husbands and wives often kept secrets from each other. And Olson said he wondered if maybe there was something going on in Jane's life that Bob might not have known about. But Bob just started to look confused, and he told Olson that he and his wife had been together long enough that they basically told each other everything that was on their minds. And if there was something he didn't know about her, it would have been something really little that had no bearing on anything. But then Bob stopped himself mid-sentence and he started shaking his head. So Olson leaned in even closer and asked Bob if he'd just remembered something. Bob looked up at Olson and then looked back down at the floor. Then he said he didn't want to talk badly about his wife, especially now that she was gone. But Olson said if he had information that could help the investigation, he needed to tell them. And so Bob nodded, took a breath, and looked back up at Olson. Then he said Jane did have a secret that she didn't keep from him, but that she did keep from almost everybody else. He said Jane smoked marijuana. At the time, marijuana was illegal in Michigan, so Bob knew Jane would have to meet with a dealer to get her supply. But Bob said he never pressed Jane about where she went or who she got her drugs from. Detective Olson immediately thought to himself there had to be a bunch of different places a wealthy suburban woman could score some weed from before she ever had to go to East Detroit to get it, but he didn't want to rule anything out. And for all he knew, maybe Jane did have other secrets she was hiding from her husband or from other people around her. So, after asking Bob a few more follow-up questions, Detective Olson thanked Bob for coming in to talk to them again, and then he also asked if Bob would be willing to submit to a DNA test, and Bob said of course. And so, while another officer prepped Bob for his DNA test, Olson headed out of the police station in Grosse Pointe Park and made his way back to Detroit. And now he planned to look into the possibility that Jane had been in East Detroit buying drugs. But before Olson could pursue this new potential lead, he got some news that would change the entire investigation. Based on evidence found in and around Jane's car, along with cell phone tracking data, the forensics team came to believe that Jane had not been killed in East Detroit. Instead, they thought the murder had taken place in Grosse Pointe Park, and then Jane's car and body had been driven to East Detroit and then abandoned there. And so that theory led a forensics team to do a sweep of Bob and Jane's garage, and that forensics team discovered blood spatter on the ground, and that blood turned out to be Jane's. And so all of a sudden, this was no longer a Detroit homicide case. And while Detective Olson and Detroit police would still be on hand to assist, the bulk of the investigation would now come down to the small Grosse Pointe Park Police Department. At about 4:30 a.m. on January 31st, 6 days after Jane's body had been discovered, an officer was working the late shift at the front desk in the Grosse Pointe Park police station. The investigation into Jane's murder had been in full swing for days, but things had been relatively quiet while investigators waited on more test results from Bob and Jane's garage. Then, suddenly, the officer at the front desk heard the station door open. He looked up and he saw this huge, hulking man walking towards him, acting kind of erratic. The man wore a suit, and he kept pulling at the jacket sleeves as he walked. Then the man stepped right up to the officer, said his name was Joseph Gentz, and that he was the man who killed Jane Bashara. At first, the officer just stared at Joseph. There were no detectives at the station that early in the morning, and he really didn't know how to handle something like this. But he pulled himself together and asked Joseph to give him his full name again. Joseph told him who he was and that he had worked as a handyman for Jane's husband, Bob. The officer still wasn't sure exactly what to do, so he led Joseph to one of the few holding cells they had at the station, he locked Joseph inside of it, and then he went back to the front desk and made some calls. And that morning, Detective Mike Narduzzi of the Grosse Pointe Park Police woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. And at first, he couldn't understand what he was hearing. So he asked the officer on the other line to slow down and tell him clearly what was going on. And when Narduzzi heard there was a man at the station confessing to Jane's murder, he shook himself awake and got dressed as fast as he could. Narduzzi had taken over the case when it moved out of Detroit, and he was already feeling totally overwhelmed. He'd only been a detective for about 3 years, and he had never handled a homicide. But as he sped down the road in his car towards the station, he told himself that a confession could be everything he had hoped for, and it could allow him and his team to close this case way faster than they expected. A few minutes later, Narduzzi arrived at the station, and he headed right to the interrogation room where Bob had been questioned a few days earlier. He walked into the room, and he saw Joseph already sitting at the small table. And Narduzzi stopped and just stared for a second. Even sitting down, Joseph looked enormous. But Narduzzi put on a smile, introduced himself to Joseph, and then sat down at the table with him. Then Narduzzi asked Joseph to explain what he knew about Jane's murder. And Joseph told Narduzzi that he had done a bunch of work for Bob at his different properties, and so that's how he knew the Bisharas. And then Joseph started explaining how he had killed Jane step by step. But then suddenly, Joseph stood up and started unbuttoning his dress shirt. Narduzzi asked him to sit down, but Joseph lifted up his shirt and showed scratches on his chest and stomach, and he said that was where Jane had fought back. Then Joseph started pacing around the small room and saying something about money, and Narduzzi kept trying to get Joseph to sit down and stay calm because he couldn't figure out exactly what Joseph was even talking about. Finally, Joseph stopped pacing, and he leaned down, looked at Narduzzi, and said there was way more to this story and that there was actually a conspiracy behind Jane's murder. But when Narduzzi asked for more clarification, Joseph just couldn't really explain what he was saying. And by the end of this meeting, Detective Narduzzi was exhausted and confused. It was clear to him that Joseph had some intellectual disabilities and that it was difficult for him to tell a clear story. But Narduzzi wondered if Joseph really was just having trouble explaining it, or if maybe he was making this up. And so the Grosse Pointe Park Police ended up holding Joseph in a cell overnight, and then they questioned him again the following day. And this time, Joseph was clearer about what had taken place on the day of Jane's murder. But by the end of that session, Narduzzi still had a lot of questions, and so he didn't think they had enough proof to charge Joseph with Jane's murder, but he did think they could get that proof down the line if they could follow up on some of the things Joseph had been talking about. So Joseph was released from police custody and told not to leave town, and the investigative team went to work trying to corroborate Joseph's story. And in early March, a little over a month after Joseph's confession, police arrested him and charged him with murder. The news of Joseph's arrest spread quickly, and it at least provided some comfort to Jane's family and friends. And the Grosse Pointe Park community was happy that justice had been served and that their town felt safe again. But in reality, this case wasn't actually closed, and it would prove to be way more bizarre than anyone had realized. Because in the months following Joseph's confession, the Grosse Pointe Park Police would receive 2 phone calls that would send investigators back into the field. And what they learned from those calls would eventually lead them to the BDSM community, and into the world of the person who called themselves Master. Based on the phone calls police received following Joseph's confession, evidence found in Jane's car and in her garage, cell phone data, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Jane Bishara on the day she was killed, January 24th, 2012. At 4:45 p.m., Jane's killer crouched in the corner of Jane's dark garage. They wore black pants, a black leather motorcycle jacket, and thick-soled black boots. The killer had gone over their plan, but they were still nervous, and they could feel their hands shaking. Then suddenly, the garage door began to open, and the overhead light went on, and the killer immediately pulled themselves as close to the wall as possible so they wouldn't be seen. Then the killer watched as Jane's Mercedes SUV pulled into the garage, and they could see Jane talking on the phone in her car. The killer took a deep breath and waited. Jane hung up the phone, turned off the engine, grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. But the killer didn't move because they weren't sure if they could go through with this. But then Jane turned around and she saw the killer and started shouting, and the killer panicked. So the killer stood up to their full huge height, they lunged out of the corner, grabbed Jane, and shoved her into the driver's side door. But Jane scratched as hard as she could at the killer's chest and managed to step away from the car, but then the killer grabbed her from behind and slammed their fist into the back of her head. Jane's purse dropped from her hand and she fell to the ground face first, and then she began pleading for help and trying to pull herself to safety. But the killer immediately dropped down to the ground right on top of Jane's back, and they wrapped their huge hands around her throat. Jane choked and struggled to breathe, and her feet started kicking wildly, and the killer could hear her shouting. Finally, the killer released their grip, and Jane's head hit the ground, and she lay there wheezing, trying to compose herself. Then the killer stood back up, raised their boot, and placed it on the back of Jane's neck and stomped. The killer heard a loud crack, and then afterward they slowly backed away from Jane's now dead body. The killer wanted to run, but then they heard a voice from the other corner of the garage, and the person who called themselves Master stepped into the light. And together, Master and the killer picked up Jane's body and put her in the backseat of the car on her knees. Then Master took off Jane's jacket and put it on her backwards, so she looked like she was bound in a straitjacket. Master grabbed Jane's purse and dumped out the contents on the passenger floorboard. Then they told the killer to drive to East Detroit and leave Jane's car there with her body inside. The killer nodded, got into the car, backed out of the garage, and sped off. And when the Mercedes was out of sight, Master, aka Bob Bashara, Jane's husband, closed the garage door. Then, Bob went into the house, changed his clothes, and headed out to drink at a bar that was housed in one of the properties he owned. It would turn out Joseph Gentz, Bob's handyman, really was Jane's killer. But Joseph had been working for Bob the whole time. The revelation of Bob's involvement in the murder would take police months to unravel, because this case led them down paths they just hadn't seen coming. And with each new piece of evidence, the case just seemed to get even stranger. Bob, aka Master, who was well known in the BDSM scene, had been planning to buy a new house for him and his partner, a woman he'd been having an affair with for years. And they were both eager to welcome a third person into their relationship who would live with them in this new house. But in order to make that happen, Bob would have to get rid of his wife Jane. And he couldn't just divorce her, because it turned out that Bob's personal wealth had taken a huge hit over the past few years, and his real estate business was failing. But if Jane was dead, Bob could collect money from her life insurance policy and her substantial 401k retirement fund, and he could drain their joint bank accounts and sell their house. And all that money would enable him to support himself and the two women he hoped to start a new life with. Joseph Gentz had brought up Bob's involvement in Jane's murder during his confession, and he had said Bob had paid him to kill Jane. But Joseph changed his story about Bob's role in the murder multiple times, so police didn't feel like they had enough evidence to initially charge Bob. But then, the woman Bob had been having an affair with reached out to police, because it turned out Bob had lied to her for years and said he and Jane were divorced, and it wasn't until she saw clips of the candlelight vigil on the news that she realized Bob had still been married, and she started to suspect that he had murdered Jane. And so she pulled away from Bob and told police they had been having an affair for years and that they were planning on buying this house together soon, but she didn't say anything to police about her and Bob's involvement in the BDSM community. But soon after that, police received the two phone calls that cracked the case wide open. The first was from a woman in Oregon who said Bob had found her on a BDSM site, and Bob had wanted her to be the woman to join him and his girlfriend as the third live-in member of their relationship. But when this woman had refused to move to Michigan and said she didn't want anything to do with Bob, he started to harass and stalk her online, and so when she read about Jane's murder and saw who Jane's husband was, she called the Grosse Pointe Park police to say Bob was potentially dangerous and could very easily have killed his wife. This led police to finding more information about Bob's life in the BDSM community, and they found others in that community who also believed Bob was capable of real violence. And then, as police started to close in on Bob, they got the second of the two important phone calls. This call was from a local furniture salesman who knew Bob, and this man said Bob had contacted him and offered him thousands of dollars to kill Joseph Gentz before Joseph could testify against Bob in court. And soon after they got that call, investigators convinced the furniture salesman to wear a wire so they could get proof of Bob offering to pay money for a hit on Joseph. The furniture salesman agreed, and Bob immediately fell into the trap, being caught on tape offering money to have Joseph murdered. And so, in late June of 2012, 5 months after Jane's murder, police finally had enough evidence to arrest and charge Bob for killing his wife. Joseph Gentz, the killer, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 17 to 28 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 2029. Bob Bashara was convicted of murder as well and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2020 at the age of 62. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your